Today, I want to talk about kind of user experience through a slightly different lens, or perhaps a sub-discipline within user experience, which is accessibility. I want to talk about why it's important, why it matters, and kind of where it overlaps with our lives as digital marketers. So as usual, we want to start with a definition. Web accessibility is the practice of making your websites and communications usable by people with disabilities. And throughout this talk, I'm probably going to be referring to a lot about websites. That's kind of my bread and butter, but this practice applies to any online communication, whether you're sending a Word doc or a PDF through an email, whether you're making slides, really any electronic communications. And we have a nice quote here by Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web. He says, "The power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect." So start off, why does accessibility matter? One, it's just the right thing to do. We want to make our communications accessible to everyone. We don't want to, no one in this room wants to, whether intentionally or unintentionally, discriminate against people who are struggling with a disability. Second reason is there are obvious market opportunities. The World Health Organization estimated in 2011 that 15% of the world's population lives with some form of disability, and that represents roughly 6 trillion in spending power. It's likely that that number has actually gone up by quite a bit since 2011. So no one wants to exclude 15% or more of their market, or whatever slice of that 6 trillion, that you have the potential to deal with in your business. 3, accessibility matters, especially when we broaden our concept of what a disability is. So one definition of a disability says that a disability is a mismatch between a person and the environment they're in. And that can be permanent, that can be temporary, or that can be situational. So when we design for the entire spectrum of ability, it winds up benefiting everyone. It winds up benefiting your marketing and your search engine optimization. So we want to broaden our concept of who our user is. As Lisa mentioned, when we're creating something or designing something, we need to keep in mind that we are not our user. It's important to talk to real users. So this nice graphic from the UX team at Microsoft describes some different kinds of disabilities that you may not have considered. Again, when we're talking about the sense of touch, it may be a more obvious one would be a permanent disability, like someone who's born with one arm. That's an obvious issue for interfacing with the computer. But what might not be so clear is that your users probably injure their arms from time to time. If you've ever had your arm in a cast or a sling, it's going to inhibit your ability to use that website or that communication that you're sending. And a situational disability would be just having something in your hands. Like in this example, there's a new parent, and when they're holding their new baby, they're not able to access the information that they would normally access on the internet in the same way that they're used to. And if they're looking for information while they're holding their baby, there's a good chance that user might be in distress, that it might be particularly critical, that your interface holds up. So another situational example that I like to talk about is when you use your mobile phone in a bright light situation, like if you're out in very bright sunlight, it becomes really difficult to sometimes read words on the screen or to distinguish elements on the page in that super bright situation. So if there's not, if the text if the text in the background aren't easily distinguishable, the text on your page is going to be really hard to read in that situation. The fourth reason accessibility matters is that it is the law. And of course, I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice, but we have a number of accessibility laws in the United States. Section 508 applies to federal government agencies and contractors. Section 504 to recipients of federal funding. The Affordable Health Care Act has stipulations for healthcare about accessible electronic communications. And perhaps the most important one would be the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. And within that, there's Title II, which applies to state local government entities. And particularly interesting is Title III of places of public accommodation. So if you worked for a Virginia public university, for example, you'd fall under Section 504 for receiving federal financial aid. You'd fall under Title II as a state government agency, and you'd fall under Title III as a place of public accommodation. The public can access your website, your library, your event spaces, things like that. So the important thing here is that courts have ruled that websites and apps are applicable under Title III of the ADA as places of public accommodation. And companies like Netflix, Nike, Target, Domino's, they've all been involved in accessibility cases where judges have ruled that their websites or apps are applicable under Title III. When someone who was blind couldn't order a pizza on the Domino's app, they ruled that that was a place of public accommodation. That person should be able to order a pizza, right? They pushed back in court, which was a really bad look for their brand, and they eventually lost. And in most of these cases, it's really expensive to remediate some of these technologies. So it's best to consider accessibility upfront. Better to fix something before launch than after launch. So how do we determine what's accessible? These laws have to have something to point at, right? Now, we have these web content accessibility guidelines, which have been developed by the World Wide Web Consortium. In 1999, the first version was released that specifically talked about HTML documents, web pages. In 2008, it was expanded to apply to documents, Word docs, PDF, things like that, and apps. In 2018, it was built out to include mobile technology and cognitive disabilities. And they're currently working in 2022 on a working draft of the next version. But in the US courts, we tend to refer to WCAG 2.0 level AA as our standard for accessibility. The EU has advanced to 2.1, and it's safe to say that the US probably will as well. But these guidelines essentially, they lay out, test criteria, for if your website or your document is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. POUR is the acronym there. And it gets fairly technical, but some of the common issues that I think we all face every day as marketers or communicators, or even just users of the internet, are as follows. So the first one I'll point out is headings. Headings should describe the structure of a document. They shouldn't be used simply for visual presentation. I want this text to look a certain way. That's not what you want. Think of it like an outline, that you would start with before you're writing a document. So there needs to be logical relationships between your headings. They should be properly nested. They should be easy to read. And there should be one heading level 1 on the page. So on the left, we see a good example where things are nicely nested. Under my favorite desserts, we have ice cream. Under ice cream, we have different flavors of ice cream. And they're heading levels flow 1, 2, 3 in a nice even order. The bad example on the left, we have multiple H1s, everything's out of order, and the last sentence, we just decided we wanted to use a big, bold font, so we put it as an H1, when really that's not a heading, that's a piece of text. Links are another really common and important issue. And what you want to do here is have descriptive anchor text or descriptive link text. So that's referring to the text that is actually applied with your link. So in this case on the left, the WCAG guidance on links is descriptive text. If I read that sentence, I know if I just read the red underlined text there, I know exactly what I'm going to get when I click on that link. Versus on the right, having a mess of like a full long URL or saying click here is not helpful. And it's not helpful for two reasons. So even sighted users scan pages looking for links to figure out where can this document take them. If you're a non-sighted user, you'd be using a screen reader, and a common pattern for screen reader users is to tab through all the links on the page with their keyboard. They'll have them read aloud to them. So no one wants to be read aloud a series of things that sound like https://www. etc. And the same thing if they tab through all the links on the page and all they hear is click here, click here, click here, click here. It doesn't help them. They don't have no idea what's on the page. So we want to use descriptive link text. We want to mock up. We want to mark up our images with alt text to ensure that someone who can't see the image knows the purpose of that image on the page. Now, sometimes it's not necessary. You know, if it's just for decorative purposes, but if this image serves, you know, an important role in the document, you know, it certainly needs to be marked up with this text. So if I was using a screen reader and I couldn't see the image, I could at least have read aloud to me in the good example, monkey riding a unicycle. I would know that that image is there and what the image contains. It's also helpful if, you know, for a sighted user, if they're on a slow mobile browser and, you know, the image couldn't be loaded for some reason, the browser will load the alt tag instead. So again, not just helpful for people with a disability, but helpful for everyone. Other common issues are with video. Videos need to be captioned for users with hearing impairments. And I think we've all probably turned on the captions on our TV just because, I don't know, maybe it was kind of loud around the house or, you know, we can't quite understand someone's accent really well. Captions are helpful for everyone, but they're critical, you know, if you have a hearing impairment. So they need to be there on all your videos. And ideally also having audio descriptions of what's in the video for people with visual impairments. And just a note on the captions, if you produce YouTube videos, you're probably aware of YouTube and other platforms auto-generating systems. I find some people don't know is that you can actually go into the platform and edit those captions. So there's proper punctuation, so you can identify the speakers, you know, who's talking at this moment, you know, add more helpful information. And the FCC actually, I believe, has guidelines on writing good captions as well. Another issue is color contrast. This is a really bad slide. If I was reading this outdoors on my mobile phone, again, I wouldn't be able to read this point blank. And certainly, you know, people, you know, with visual impairments certainly cannot. So we need to use sufficient contrast between colors. The text needs to stand out to a certain extent against the background, and there are hard quantitative rules, you know, for how much text background contrast is sufficient for text of any given size, and I'll share a tool for that later. Another issue is forms. You know, Lisa talked a lot about forms. They're really tricky, but just simple level, you know, keep your forms simple as possible. Ensure that the form is keyword navigable. You know, that's essential if you can't use a mouse. But even though I can use a mouse, I often choose to tab through forms to take me to the next field. And ensure form fields are labeled and can be read with the screen reader. And here's a nice guideline from Facebook about making your ads accessible. But the point I really want to make with this slide is just that whatever type of online communication you're producing, you know, if it's a TikTok or an Instagram reel, you can Google Instagram reel accessibility and figure out what you can do to make your Instagram reels more accessible to more people. And just to wrap up here really quickly, my favorite part about this is how much it overlaps with my day-to-day work. A lot of accessibility is just about using web technology correctly. And when we broaden our concept of a user and we start including more people in the websites and products that we produce, it also helps search engine bots. All these things, having a logical heading structure, image alt text, using readable content, having descriptive links, captions and transcripts, all these things improve not just accessibility, but SEO as well. You know, if a user and a screen reader can understand the content on your page, Google can also understand the content as well. So, and just really quickly, a few tools. I like to use a screen reader sometimes in a Google Chrome extension called ChromeVox, which allows me to hear the content on a web page to ensure that it can be read aloud, you know, as if I was using kind of a full-fledged screen reader. There's the web and color contrast checker that I was referring to. You can plug in different color combinations and see if they comply with the WCAG guidelines, and the wave evaluation tool. So if you want to kind of get into, you know, is my website accessible, you know, and what steps can I take to make it more accessible, try downloading this wave evaluation tool. It will test your pages against the WCAG standards and provide some remediation tips. And give you some good ideas. Probably some of it gets fairly technical, but you can always seek out an expert in accessibility.